What is the Septuagint exactly? Well, the Septuagint very loosely is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament that was created around the 250-ish BC, so 250 or so years before Christ, in Alexandria, North Africa, part of Egypt at the time. For the Library of Alexandria. It consists of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, which we'll talk about in just a moment, as well as pretty much all the rest of the Old Testament, well, all the rest of the Old Testament, in addition to what we now call the Apocrypha, which includes some additions to existing Old Testament books, such as the book of Esther and the book of Daniel, as well as a bunch of new books that are not part of the rest of the Old Testament at all, such as Tobit and things like that. Why does any of this matter? Why do we care about a translation of the Hebrew text that was done 250 years before Christ that nobody reads today? Well, actually, it is quite significant, and there are 3 reasons why it's significant. The first one is it gives us some insight into how the Jews of the intertestamental period, that 250 year through to after really the time of Christ, how they viewed the Old Testament itself, including things like translation philosophy, how they understood that things should be moved over into Greek from Hebrew, because we find times that where the Greek they translated into does not exactly match the Hebrew that they were translating from, to the best of our knowledge. At least not our Masoretic text that we use today for the Hebrew Old Testament is a little bit different. And sometimes that actually tells us something about perhaps the reason why, the things they were thinking behind that. For instance, we were reading just this week in Numbers chapter 13 inside the Greek Mastery membership, and we found there that the text of the Septuagint refers to the spies being sent to spy out not this Negev, which is what the Greek, what the Hebrew and now our English translations say, but this wilderness. And we ask the question, well, why did they choose to translate this as wilderness rather than translate it as the Negev? And part of the reason may be that it was going to an audience that actually didn't know where the Negev was, and so just translating it as wilderness would be perhaps more understandable to them. So it helps us to understand how the Jews of the day were thinking about their own culture, their own background, their own land, even the distribution of them, and so on. And so the Septuagint is important from an insight into the Jews of the time and how they viewed their own Old Testament, as we call them today, texts. A second reason that the Septuagint matters is because it influenced the New Testament writers. We see a huge number of times where the New Testament quotes from the Old Testament and quotes directly the Greek text of the Old Testament, not the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. And other times we find times where they quote the Hebrew, but then insert something from the Greek where it's a little bit different to the Hebrew. So we find that the New Testament writers were reading from the Septuagint pretty consistently and incorporating ideas from the Septuagint into their ideas, which then, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, make their way into the New Testament. So the Septuagint is important because it influences the thinking and the theology of New Testament writers, and that comes out in New Testament writings themselves. And a third reason that the Septuagint is important today is because even today it's still influencing scholars. For instance, did you know that there are a number of times in your English Standard Version, assuming you use an ESV, where the Old Testament translation in the ESV actually takes the Hebrew text, compares it to the Greek text, and sometimes sides with the Greek text of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, rather than the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. Now, not all translations do this, certainly, but the ESV does this in a number of places, and it's not the only translation that does this. And so understanding a little bit about the Septuagint is actually really helpful, because that helps us to think through some of those those translation choices and source choices that translators are making in some of these texts. So the Septuagint then is an important book, and it is worth being aware of ourselves even today. Let me just give you a little bit more detail on the background behind where the Septuagint comes from, just because this is a little bit interesting and helpful. This Pentateuch was translated during the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus in North Africa, and he was the pharaoh, if you like, or the king, Ptolemy, king of in Egypt, somewhere in the middle of the 2nd century. I can't remember the exact dates. So around that period, he was looking to translate a Greek text will have the Hebrew Old Testament translated into Greek so that he could add it to the library at Alexandria, which was being built up and was a well-known and well-respected library at the time. So that's where this is where it really started. So the story goes, there was a letter by an individual called Aristeas from way back in probably the early, AD sort of period of time. We're not entirely sure when it was written, that explains to some extent the story of how Ptolemy Philadelphus actually instigated or got underway this translation of the Old Testament. And of course, what he did is he talked to the Jews sent to Jerusalem, the high priest put together, according to Aristeas, a number of scholars, 6 from each of the tribes of Israel, and sent them to Egypt, to Alexandria, to do a translation of the Old Testament along with appropriate texts that they could work from. They were then taken to an island where they were able to translate, and they all translated the text over a period of 72 days or something like that. I think it is 72, that's Aristeas' original number. And from that, we of course get the LXX, the Roman numerals for 70. There's some modifications take place, but that doesn't matter. And so over a period of time, they translated the Pentateuch, just the 5 books of Moses, into Greek for Ptolemy Philadelphus, which was then looked at by some of the Hebrew Jews that were there in Alexandria at the time. It got their endorsement, and therefore it was incorporated into the library, copied and sent around the known world. So it became quite well distributed, quite well read, and so on. But that wasn't where it finishes, because of course that's only the first 5 books of Moses. Thereafter, we're not actually sure about a lot of the other books, exactly when they were written or by who, or even what Hebrew texts in some cases they were all using, because there is evidence to suggest that some of these books weren't all using the same Hebrew text as their source. But over the next couple of centuries, at least from the middle 2nd century BC through to about 200-ish AD, we have the other books that we now have in the Septuagint, as we call it, the Greek Old Testament that we circulate together as a unit, were being translated, and some were even being composed from scratch. And that's particularly those books like Tobit and other books that are completely separate to Old Testament books that were not compiled in Hebrew, but compiled to begin with in Greek, and distributed for the most part with the Septuagint, with the Pentateuch, and so on. So that's a little bit of the history of it. In terms of translation philosophy, the Hebrews who translated, the Jews who translated the Hebrew into the Greek, have been very literal for the most part. They've wanted to preserve almost word for word, particularly in the Pentateuch, word for word, what they read there into Greek, which has sometimes led to some slightly awkward Greek. You end up with phrases that match the Hebrew slavishly in places. In other places where, like I mentioned before, we have slight differences, partly because perhaps they've made an editorial choice, and sometimes perhaps because they've just had a different Hebrew text to work from and have incorporated new ideas. And then some of those ideas may not be because there's a Hebrew text behind it, or any particular text, but because there may be editorial concerns or apologetic issues that they might be kind of thinking about as well. But nonetheless, scholars have been working on this, and there's some great resources out there, which I'll put in the description below, just in case you're interested in finding out more about them. Speaking of things, down in the description below, you'll find just above that, by the way, there's a like button in case you like this video and you want to help other people find it as well. So hit that, and that'll be helpful. But you'll also find down there a bunch of other links that I'm going to give you as well, because I really want to encourage you, because it was International Septuagint Day yesterday, if you do nothing else, at least buy a reasonably priced book about the Septuagint. That will make me feel a whole lot better, and at least you'll participate to some extent in International Septuagint this year. How to get into this? Let's start by reading a book about the Septuagint, and the one I'm going to recommend here is by William Ross and Greg Lanier. They've just released this book a very short time ago, I think a month, 2 months ago, and I actually mentioned in the last video as well. So I reckon this is a very worthwhile book to read. It's called The Septuagint, What It Is and Why It Matters. It's a short, very well written book, very accessible, very easy to understand. In fact, I mentioned in the last video that this was the best book on the Septuagint I've ever read, certainly from a getting into it point of view. There are other books that are more academic and other books that provide some different views, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend those as a starting book. This is a great book to start with. And in fact, next month in our growth membership, I'll leave a link here to help you with that. You can go find out more about that just here. In our growth membership, we're actually reading this book, and we're going to be talking about the Septuagint in more depth. So if you're interested in more on that, bma.to/growth. I look forward to seeing you maybe join us for that. Anyway, this is a great book, well worth reading, and I encourage you to go purchase a copy. Links are in the description below. The other thing you could do, of course, even if you don't know any Greek, you can get an English translation of the Greek translation of the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. And if you do that, then you will, of course, be reading a translation of a translation, but you'll be able to see at least some of the places where it changes words and adds things in and changes orders, such as in Jeremiah, where the ordering is all out of whack compared to a Hebrew text. You'll be able to see that and follow along and actually see how those changes impact the flow of a book. Read those apocryphal books and so on. Now, the apocryphal books are not canonical. We don't regard those as inspired or inerrant, but they are interesting for a variety of reasons, which I've already mentioned. So it's worth reading an English translation, if nothing else. But of course, if you do have a little bit of Greek, there is a wonderful reader's edition by the same people, Ross and Lanier, who wrote the introduction, the book I was talking about just before. There's a 2-volume reader's edition, nice big thick volumes. Very good though, if you want to just kind of read it and you've only got a basic vocabulary of the New Testament. Very accessible, and you can get into reading the New Testament. I'll leave a link to that in the description below as well. And then finally, what I normally use is I normally actually use Logos Bible software on my iPad, and I will read through the Greek text of the Septuagint using the Logos, Ralph's Hanhart, essentially, Logos Septuagint with morphology. And again, I'll leave a link to that below as well. And of course, you can get a German Bible Society one, which is just a single volume, reasonably thick, same size as a UBS or NA28. That's well worth having one of those on your shelf. And that's typically what I'm going to pick up and look at if I'm going to be reading Septuagint in something physical. So that's it for this video. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you do participate to some extent in International Septuagint Day, 8th of February every year. Go grab one of the books below to help be part of the action. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, because we do videos like this every week. Thanks again for watching. Keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery of Greek and Hebrew. And I should say, welcome to the Biblical Mastery Academy YouTube channel. We just renamed it. There you go. See you in the next video.